Hello and welcome to Desktop Deployment. I'm Dave and today I'll be showing you a quick way to paint Beastmen without needing an airbrush. With Old World around the corner, I wanted to have an army ready for when it's released, and I've always liked the idea of having a Beastmen army. Knowing that Old World or Warhammer Fantasy is a rank and file style wargame, I'd need to have a lot of models, and so need a paint scheme that would look good but wasn't going to take me years to complete. To give you an idea of how effective this scheme is, this army took me just over a month to paint. And please bear in mind that I do have a full-time job, so this was completed in evenings and weekends, and I still had a fair few nights where I didn't paint at all. This scheme works fastest when working in batches, so if you have big units or several units of the same type, it's better to try and do these at the same time, as by the time you've finished a step, the first models that you painted will be dry for the next step. A word of warning for this, the models will look terrible until the last few steps, so don't give up halfway through just because it looks rubbish. To start with, you'll need to build your models and bases. You can paint the models on their bases, but I find it's a lot quicker to keep them separate. Just remember not to glue your models too well to their temporary bases if you do decide to follow this guide. With the models built, you'll need to undercoat them with a black. For speed, it's probably best to use a rattle can. Once the undercoat is dry, you'll need to give the model a white dry brush. Make sure to cover the whole model, especially the upper parts of the model. Now it's time to start the painting proper. I will always try and start with the deepest part of the model. In this case it will be the skin. Using a flesh tone, ink, wash or contrast paint, cover all of the skin on the model. You don't need to be particularly neat with this, but it will look better if you try and not get any of the skin tone on the sections that will have bone or horn. Throughout this process, when using washes, inks or contrast paints, try your best not to flood the model, as you can always go back over a section if you want the colour to be bolder or stronger. Next up, I use a bone coloured ink, wash or contrast paint to cover any exposed bones or horns. Once the skin tone is dry, I move on to the hair and fur. For this I use a brown ink, but you could also use a wash or contrast paint. Be careful not to accidentally cover any of the sections that you've already completed. After the hair and fur is dry, you can move on to the leather and ropes. I personally use the same colour for these as I think the textures help tell the eye the difference between the materials. With the leather complete, I paint the hooves with a black. The hooves on this model are textured, so I'm using a contrast paint so it won't be a flat colour. Next I move on to anything that is wood. For this I'm using a brown paint which I'll dry brush later, but you could still use a contrast if you wanted. I just think painting this section doesn't take that long, and the use of a wash on this part and the metals will help tie them both into the model. Whilst the brown is drying, I quickly do some of the details on the face, like painting the eyes black and painting the teeth with an ivory. If you've managed to get some of the white from the initial dry brush into the mouth, it might be worth using a pinky purpley wash, ink or contrast paint here also. I then go back and dry brush all of the wood with a bright brown. Once the brown is dry, I then paint all of the metal parts with the silver, and once the silver is dry, I give all of the wood and metal areas a brown wash just to weather them. After the model is dry, I like to add some blood spatter to the model. For this I mix a tiny amount of black with a clear red and dab it onto the model. For an edge of the weapon and some of the spikes of the armour which might have been shoved into an unlucky victim, I also put some on the shield as it's been used to bash enemies. If your model has any body parts as trophies, you might want to add some of the blood to these areas as well. With the model drying, it's time to paint the base. I start by painting off the base with a brown, but if you're doing a few bases it might be worth spraying them with a brown rattle can. Any rocks on the base I paint with a dark grey, and once dry I go over with a lighter grey. When the rocks are dry I give the whole base a brown wash. After the wash is dried, I dry brush the ground with a bright brown and the rocks with an off-white. You could stop here, but I'm going for a snow style base, so I then wash the whole base with a blue to add a cold tone. Once the base is dry, I lightly dry brush the whole thing with an off-white before adding patches of snow texture paint. I then ease the model from the temporary base and glue them to their new base. Once the glue is dry, I paint the rim of the base. And with that, it's finished. This style of painting will work perfectly for games like Warhammer Fantasy, where you have to have a lot of models to paint, and then you can take a bit of extra time with any special models like monsters or characters. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.